Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode. And it's the guys. It's just the three of us today. And we're going to get into some fun conversation. But before we do, let's just go around the horn and introduce ourselves, because you may be one of those people that has never tuned into this podcast before. So I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I've written a few books. One of those books is The Household and the War for the Cosmos. And that apparently is the one that everybody likes, or at least reviews. So anyway, that's enough about me. How about you, Glenn?
Glenn Sunshine, Senior Fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, a ministry associate at Reflections Ministries, retired history professor, freelance speaker, writer, bunch of other odds and ends.
Okay, I guess that was also an ad. You can contact Glenn if you want him to speak.
There you got it.
All right. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself and then tell us what we're talking about today? It's your day.
Okay, I'm Tom Price. Feel free to reach out to me as well, for whatever reason. I teach theology, ethics, philosophy, a bunch of other things, talk on a bunch of them, write about a bunch of them, and I'm going to be talking about some of that today. So anyway, we are in the season of Advent, and we, of course, are thinking about those things, and a lot of the celebration is showing up all around us. There's lights and lightings and Christmas trees and ornaments and all kinds of stuff at stores, and just about from every direction. Even up here in New England, you are reminded that it is the season of Advent and Christmas is coming. And so I figured,
so even in New England.
Yeah, even in New England, which may really play into kind of my.
Well, here I want to just throw out a thought. You can tell this sort of the political and sort of social outlook of a person depending on the color of their Christmas lights. So if it's all white and you just got like white candles in the windows and so forth, and you're in a more upscale community in New England, you're dealing with probably, liberals, Democrats, stuff like that. But if you got lots of green and red lights and inflatable, Frosty the Snowman and, Rudolph's and Santa Clauses out front, you're talking about regular people that probably actually enjoy Christmas.
I have that all over my neighborhood, so that's a good that's a good sign. So my topic today is some themes that are kind of the consequence of the incarnation, and Christmas, of course, being one of those, and some of the variety of things that, as we think about the Advent, the event of Christmas, as Scripture gives it to us, that we still have questions about, or we may find that things have shown up in the world as a consequence of Christ becoming incarnate that we don't always know what to do with. Some of that is even amongst Christians with Christmas. So we will be hitting on a variety of themes. But the first theme I wanted to talk about that comes out of that is when you're reading the Gospels, of Luke, for example, and you have the announcement from the angelic hosts, one of the things that you hear in that great unveiling is peace on earth and goodwill towards men. Right? This is one of the things that is announced with Christmas. And I was reflecting on this, that one of the things that the Christmas tradition, as it's been shaped by the Christmas story and Christ and the incarnation, is that you do have a lot of hymnody and songs and celebrations that do radiate something of joy and a kind of happiness and a waiting and an excitement and an anticipation, all of these things that are very human and very biblical. But when you hear this, that, in this event, peace on earth is coming with this child to be born and goodwill towards men, what you get at the very moment, even in the stories of the gospel, is anything that appears to be very peaceful. And there's not a whole lot of goodwill, even though we try to muster something of that up during this season so we all don't look like the Scrooge, right? So what did come into the world, and what do we mean by peace and goodwill has entered the world, has impacted it? We see glimpses of it even in the time of celebrating Christmas, but we don't see the full flood of it, right? So what can it mean? And I think the first thing I throw out there is that this notion of Christ coming with the first advent is also something of a partial apocalyptic. It's that peace has entered into a world that knows nothing of it, and it is entered in its first fruit. And so what we see here is that this kind of peace is not pacifism or utopianism, but it is something of battle. It is a battle against the disharmony and the discord. And so there is something about it that is disruptive. As a matter of fact, Jesus coming on the scene was already impacting the political world, for which Herod ends up slaughtering a bunch of children at the possibility that he could have a challenge to his worldly power, right? So peace is coming, but this peace doesn't mean absence of brutality, absence of battle. As a matter of fact, it might be a call to battle.
Yeah, thinking about the slaughter of the innocents, that's noted and observed during the Advent season. I know in the Eastern Church. Is it also in the Roman Catholic, maybe in the Anglican traditions as well?
On I think it's December 27th.
Yeah.
Somewhere around there, somewhere during the 12 days of Christmas, you see that.
Yeah, that's certainly not something we associate with Frosty the Snowman. That's a pretty somber thing to recall, and to put into the church calendar so that every year, we're reminded that this happened. Getting to the idea of peace, though, pacification, which means to bring the peace, has a militant tone because it's about subjecting the rebel or the troublemaker, to the peace, reconciling him to the peace by disarming him. In other words, saying you're gonna get peaceful here right now, here, guy, whether you like it or not. And if you're not peaceful, we're going to get violent with you. Pacification. That's what it means.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the modern trend that is very steeped in a kind of individual notion of pacifism as a kind of utopian ideal that I can embrace personally. I mean, that's the way it's usually presented, is foreign to this kind of understanding. First of all, it's a very modern way of thinking about things, but it's also so detached from the conditions of the fallen world that has been broken into by the eternal, that the modern world doesn't even have categories for really dealing with that kind of reality. And then you couple this with this notion. Well, I'll give you another example. I remember when I was a new Christian going to one of these little Christian bookstores that were fashionable once upon a time. And one of the guys who ran it, he was a good, King James only Puritan Baptist, looking endlessly for any little way the church had things wrong. And one of the things I remember him criticizing was he was criticizing the song Silent Night, Stille Nacht, because, the night was anything but silent there in this busy town. And I think he was really missing the point of the song, which is pretty characteristic of folks like that, in that it's talking about the way that in the midst of all of this discord and disharmony, there is this child that is the Prince of Peace. And there is a calm that has been brought to the people of God in this one, that whatever the external circumstances of suffering, challenge, fighting, trial, temptation, they are not in the same condition they were without hope prior to the coming of the Messiah.
Yeah, what's that other song, that famous song, um, "The Bells on Christmas Day"?
I heard the
Guys,
bells on Christmas Day. Yeah.
yeah, which is, they sound, and it's boy, I shouldn't have brought it up because I don't have the lyrics off the top of my head, but somebody out there in podcast land probably knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah. It was written, if I remember right, during the Civil War.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm blanking out on the poet's name, but he was one of the famous poets of the day. And he was talking about the fact that this idea of peace on earth just
Hmm.
in his day made no sense at all, and yet he looked beyond it to the hope that comes with Christ.
Right. Yeah, that's the gist of it, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's worth noting,
And
by the
so
way, that the word peace doesn't really do justice to the biblical concept of peace or shalom. That it's more than just we're going to get along. It's more than just pacification. The word shalom points to the sense that everything that is needed for human flourishing is present. It's a very holistic type word. And although we've got the New Testament written in Greek, I think we can be pretty sure it's echoing the Hebrew shalom in its use of the Greek word irene there.
Yeah, I think the irony, I mean, the little bit of different emphasis tends to be on a kind of a realizable unity within the brokenness of things. But I think shalom is pointing directly to that as well. I think they are pretty parallel in the way they're used in Scripture. But what you get with Jesus, of course, is the inbreaking, right? Of peace and eternity into time, and a time that has been broken in some sense. And so you do get, in many ways, the first fruits of that with the Spirit's descent onto the people of God, the church, and in their life together. And again, as if anyone knows church history and church life, that too has been anything um, in terms of worldly notions of getting along and peaceableness. Nevertheless, it hasn't negated what Christ has brought and what the Spirit is able to supply. What it does mean is that the conditions we are in are truly broken, and they are the first fruits of being restored to Christ. And so there is going to be a continuous battle until all things are brought into subjection to Christ and he fills all things. And so this too is going to have something of us having the peace of God and the assurance that comes with his promise and his person and presence, but also the assurance that when you're in this world, you are going to have tribulation. If you are with Christ, you are going to be hated by all men outside of Christ. And so this isn't just you're going to be disliked, you're going to be hated, right? So there is anything but the bringing of the final shalom at this point, even though we are partakers of it. And that's why I meant the kind of apocalyptic rather than the utopian. Because there is a kind of inbreaking and battle, and talk about war of the cosmos. This is directly a part of it. The family, of course, is right at part of the center of it. So these things are there, and you notice later, for example, in John 14:27, you've got peace, but not of this world, right? I give you peace, but it isn't the kind the world has on offer. And so those are things to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about peace on earth. But what about the other side, goodwill towards men? Here's another thing that oftentimes is found lacking and wanting. And yet there is something of the first fruits of our wills being turned away from merely being curved in on themselves, now outwards towards a people together oriented to Christ and serving. And so there is the first fruits of that, even if we don't get the full realization at this point.
So related to that, Tom, when we think about goodwill toward men, uh, is your reading that the goodwill is men expressing goodwill toward other men, or God promising goodwill, his goodwill toward men, or both? I think it's. I've got some thoughts on this, but one of the things that was a kind of a thing that I had to reconcile myself to years ago is that no matter how much I work to be likable, there are people who just don't like me. They don't have goodwill. In other words, and some of those people spend a lot of their time waiting for me to mess up or do something that they can sort of seize upon to harm me. I've experienced it at different points in my life. But now I'm at a stage now, the old, I think I've used this before so many times that it's probably gotten on people's nerves, but, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that people aren't out to get you. I'm at a stage where I'm kind of paranoid, but I've got some evidence or some basis for my paranoia. I really do know that there are people who are out to get me. I'd like a little more goodwill in the world. In other words, I might be at peace with them in one sense, in the sense that they're not attacking me at the moment. But give them a chance, and they will.
Well, that's right. I think you could see. I watch, for example, what Christians do to each other on X, which used to be Twitter. And for any little thing you say, you get nothing but endless critique. They spend all their time nitpicking to where the whole mission of the church, other than nitpicking each other, becomes eclipsed. And so where is the goodwill even for each other? And so there is definitely something apocalyptic, I think, about it. When it's announced, of course, it's embodied in Christ, and I think you're right. The turning of God's favor to us through Christ's work. And that becomes a first fruit for the development of a people within the world embodied by the Spirit, that there is still a unity that all of their bad will cannot break down, and that the gates of hell still will not prevail against this people, no matter how on the surface broken and lacking of goodwill there is. In other words, something is entered into the bloodstream of history now because of Christ through the Spirit, that even if on the surface we are not seeing its manifestation, it is a promise and it is there. And it shows up in the strangest places, like songs written to celebrate Christmas, a spirit that starts to develop of people when you start to reflect on what is this Christ all about, right? And again, it's just little glimpses of something that, think of the world and think of Christmas. There wouldn't be one, of course, but think of it apart from Christ ever coming. You wouldn't have any sense of even what this kind of goodwill would even look like in the smallest degree. And so my point is something entered here that is irreversible, and it's tied to promise. But you're exactly right. I think it's apocalyptic, and it even goes against the grain of our natures as they rebel against their full transformation, during the process of sanctification. And sadly, other brothers could even be guilty of wanting to bring other brothers down. Just because of a kind of resistance to that goodwill.
Well, that, and also, it gives someone an advantage if I can somehow make someone else look bad, then perhaps by contrast I look good, or maybe because I expose the thing that I'm bringing to light, I am, seen as a hero of a sort. So I think that comes into play.
Yeah. There's actually, we've got a bit of a translation issue here too. Exactly how that phrase, two men of goodwill, should be translated is, that's the King James. But the more recent translations tend to say, peace on earth to men on whom God's favor rests, or something like that. or to men who have God's goodwill. I mean, the focus tends to be less about goodwill to men as something that is coming separate from the peace, but rather that the peace is coming to men who have God's favor, who toward whom God has goodwill. So and I think that's what you were getting at a moment ago, Chris. The translation is a little bit tricky.
Yeah. And what this inspired for me is, even before, I grew up in a home that was, at the very beginning, just very nominally Christian, and then got into stuff that is explicitly non-Christian, but we still observed Christmas. It was like a thing that you had to do, not just because it was like the thing that everybody did, but because there was something about it that you enjoyed, and there was something to the kind of the spirit of it that just and it wasn't greed. It wasn't just. This is my opportunity to get all the toys I want, although that certainly was in play. I remember one year I got out I think it was the Sears catalog, which back in those days was like the size of an encyclopedia, and going through the toy section and circling everything I wanted. I think this is like 1970 or so. I came up to like about $3,000, and I gave my parents the list, but. Do you remember Stevie Wonder's song "I Wish"? There's a line in that song where it's very nostalgic. He's talking about the days, when he was a kid and how great they were, and he wishes they could go back. But it starts off looking back on when I was a little nappy-headed boy, which is something that a black person would say back in the 70s and the 60s and stuff. That was a particular thing. Then my only worry was for Christmas, what would be my toy? And then he goes on to say, even though we sometimes would not get a thing, we were happy with the joy that the day would bring. So this is Stevie Wonder singing a popular song. This is something that was, in the top 10 on the radio. This is not like something that would be given a recognition at the Dove Awards for being a Christian song. Yeah. This is just a song back in the day, But even he could see. There was, something more to it as a little kid than just getting what you want for Christmas. And I think that's something that critics of Christmas who, are dismissive of the crass materialism that's often associated with. I get that. But there was always been more to it than that. Even people who aren't Christians know there's more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see that. I mean, classic stories, Dickens stories and different ones that kind of start to measure when people get so consumed by the idol of money because of some hurt in the past, right, that turns it into a god and they become dehumanizing. These stories, they reverberate, they echo something that the real event has sent sort of waves out into the world, and these things have become a part of our tradition because of the impact of Christianity. And so I think one of the things that one sees, especially with Christmas and what you're talking about, is the way in which, since Christ comes into the world and leaves consequences, those consequences aren't just our individual piety or just our regular everyday kind of piety, but there are focal points that center on key events like his birth and its significance and meaning that spill over and transform culture, society, and that when they do that, there is something in our festivals and our celebrations that are impacted by the meaning and significance of Christ and as the Prince of Peace and the coming joy that scratch at our longings as creatures. And they do allow us to get a drop or a taste of something that Christianity brings, even if they don't run with it. They take it in, again, fallen directions. And it's similar. You could think of the way that Christianity impacted healthcare, right? The care of the sick and the development of hospitals, right? There are people who may not believe in God or the gospel, but they're going to run to get taken care of to one because of the goods that have come from it. And I think a lot of times we only look at the negatives, like, oh, sometimes, the holiday can eclipse the reason for the season. But we don't realize that people may be grabbing a hold of the only thing they at this moment are able to get that are actually reverberations of what Christmas and Christ is all about. And they can be ways of us pointing to the rich fullness that Christ is and what you can have in him that isn't merely a holiday, but is actually something that you can partake of eternally.
Yeah, this reminds me of the criticisms that people have concerning church buildings. So, it is possible for a church to go off the rails, even become a synagogue of Satan. But the building itself, unless you tear down that steeple and take out the windows and get rid of the cross, is saying something that actually contradicts maybe the thing that's being said in the pulpit. So you go into a place like Harvard Square, right? And you can't see a church that's theologically sound anywhere in sight. But the buildings are theologically sound, and they're pointing up, with their steeples.
Yeah.
And there are people who in our contemporary situation where people are enamored with, and for good reasons, the fact that the early church didn't have any buildings and they were faithful and so forth. Well, the reason they didn't have any buildings, of course, is because they were being persecuted. But the moment that they could start building them, they did. But
even while they were being persecuted.
Yeah.
Even prior to Constantine, there were church buildings.
And the thing about, though, you get this sort of, nostalgia for the spiritual church at the expense of the visible church, including its architecture. And, everybody wants to worship in anything that doesn't look like a church, a warehouse, a mall, a storefront, whatever. They want to be somewhere else besides a church building. And what ends up occurring is if, the Christian faith in a particular area disappears, they've left no physical evidence that it was ever there. Is that really what we're up to?
Yeah. When you take a look at the history of anti-Christmas celebrations, where you really have to look for, at least as near as I can tell, the origin of that, a lot of it came from the Puritans. And you have to understand what the Puritans were reacting to. Christmas in that period was a pretty decadent kind of thing. The sorts of celebrations and things like that. Yeah, there were things that were connected to the church, but a lot of it was really pretty, chaotic, rambunctious, decadent. And so they reacted against the decadence of the celebration by banning the celebrations, which I think was really the wrong answer. It's interesting when you go to probably my least favorite Christmas song that shows up in a lot of hymnals, "It Came Upon a Midnight Clear." It was written by a Unitarian.
Yeah,
and if you look at it, there's absolutely no reference to Christ. There's no reference to incarnation, nothing like that in it. And yet that song was written because at the time, all of the Christmas songs out there were completely secular. It was an attempt to bring some sort of religious meaning back to Christmas. And it was done by a Unitarian.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, what I find interesting here is you can go back to St. Augustine, Jerome, people like that. They've got extensive sets of Christmas sermons. This was something that was celebrated at a point where people are still, would describe these guys as church fathers, really important thinkers and all that. Yet they are advocating the celebration of Christmas, albeit in different terms than what we've got now.
Yeah.
So,
well,
I'll probably
I think
talk
one of the
about
things that
Augustine's sermons at a later podcast.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you will see that oftentimes from a crass puritanical viewpoint is basically a bad relationship to everything the church did prior to them coming on the scene. And I understand because of abuses, but it's also a removal of themselves from from the situations that gave rise to those things. I'll give you an example. Chris just talked about the way in which we tend to favor certain ways of communicating the gospel in our particular context, right? In a secular world, you almost want to peer, these churches accommodate to a secular form of worship, if you will, that it's no different than going to a shopping mall or something along those lines. Christianity early on didn't settle for that. I mean, if you start just with the way the church had to articulate the biblical teaching in a new context, the Gentile world, and when those different heresies arised, they realized that they were going to have to utilize pagan language to express biblical truth, but they were going to have to gut that language and re-employ it. In other words, they're going to take a creaturely thing and they're going to wean it off of all those things that are not true and refashion it so that it can express truth. And they didn't just do that with technical terms. The church did it with everything because all things now are to be refashioned in light of Christ the center. And so no longer are pagan things pagan. They're only pagan insofar as they haven't been restructured and reoriented to Christ. So a festival that once used to celebrate something pagan is now going to have to be everything about it that has, eclipses the truth of Christ is going to have to wean off. Those aspects that have to do with just creatureliness can hang on, but those parts that distort or pervert truth in the fullness of Christ, they're going to have to go. The church was imperfect in doing it, as we are, but it's the way in which we utilize our work in the world as Christians to bring all things into subjection to Christ. He marks all of time now for the church. So the calendar has to be Christianized for Christians. And so this is what you see the church doing, usually out of necessity, but you see it doing it nonetheless. And so if Christ is the mark point of all time and the center of it and the point of it all, then everything has to be refashioned and reoriented that way, even those aspects of the cultures we're in.
You bring up an important thing that has troubled me for years, and that's this contemporary practice among scholars to use CE or Common Era for Anno Domini, the year of the Lord, and the fact that ostensibly Christian scholars do the same thing now without self-consciousness or even an apology, I think betrays this very truth that, that Christ and his first advent is at the center of things, which is an interesting thing to think about with regard to our Puritan friends. I've got Puritan sympathies, but at the same time, they were kind of selective. Wouldn't you agree, Glenn? They didn't trouble themselves with the AD and BC, phenomenon, which we don't actually have a biblical proof text for. in other words, there's not a place that says, and from now on, you will date your calendar, in reference to Christ. But they did it.
Actually, if you're going to be using biblical standards for dating, the only one we have is starting with the Exodus.
Yeah.
So
then we go back to the Jewish calendar.
Right.
By the way, there are people within the Christian world who would actually support that. I've been dealing with there's a kind of phenomenon that you have here in the Pacific Northwest of a kind of Torah observant Christian kind of trend, and it's a bit of a new thing for me. I mean, I didn't have to sort of even think about it, this sort of thing, very much back east, but out here, you got some of it.
Yeah, I've run into that too.
Yeah.
I kind of want to encourage them to reread Acts 15.
Yeah.
But
or Galatians or Hebrews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Well, this is something you get when you jettison tradition, but you need it. And I mean tradition in the right sense of the word, a tradition being fashioned by the impact of Christ. And you see this all around, like when the Puritans basically removed, themselves from certain kinds of public observance and impacting culture that way. Some kind of quote unquote secular or as Glenn mentioned, Unitarian vision fills the gap. And I think it is this longing for the pure and the ultimate advent, right? The pure kingdom, which is something we all long for. But we aren't under those conditions yet. And so even though we aim at it, we still are having to take, as Christ took, broken, fallen human flesh, assumed it, and renewed it. That's where we are. We're dealing with a world that was broken in sin, and the first truth and light of Christ is now being able to be shown in that darkness. And it has and does things. It transforms things its own way, but it doesn't transform them yet into a perfect temple or a perfect, culture. It just continuously has an impact as we bring those things into conformity. And so, yeah, everything down to our folklore and our stories and everything else are kind of retold. We take those things that were part of the broken world and they get refashioned, which brings up an interesting point. The difference between, I think, Lewis and Tolkien, we've talked about before with their way of co-creating. But Lewis's approach, often we mentioned, was one that would incorporate, a lot of these varieties into his way of dealing with the way in which reality is to be seen in its fullness. So you'll have Father Christmas, a couple of, Greek gods, and, Aslan, all in the same reality sphere. And of course, Tolkien didn't like it. He wanted to have a kind of a world as close to the reality as reality could be, but not bringing in familiarity from this world into the imaginary world. And so they both had different approaches. But it shows you how they understood language and culture, and prior to Christ, with Christ, and transformed by Christ. And that is, I think, a huge contribution and help in helping us navigate the impact of Christ and culture.
This is something that I've thought a little bit about here and there. Lewis and Tolkien were coming at, the Christian faith, obviously, as a Roman Catholic with Tolkien and an Anglican with Lewis. But you could also say that their metaphysics overlap, but were distinct from each other. Lewis was more Platonic, and Tolkien a Thomist, or maybe you could say with Lewis an Augustinian, and in terms of his approach. And maybe that's in part why they went about their work as writing fiction in the ways that they did. There is a kind of, when you're dealing with, the Thomist approach, if you think about the way substance and accident relate to each other and so forth, there's a way things can kind of get bound up with each other that with a more Platonic approach, it's easier to separate. So I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head. I'm philosophizing or theologizing off the top of my head, which is dangerous practice. Dangerous practice. We don't do this at home. But as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, the fact that Lewis could throw all this stuff together was because he saw, in kind of he saw lateral connections. He saw similarities, and he could trace those back to formal things that were real, but were instantiated differently in different situations, if you get my drift.
Yeah. What's interesting here, I think, is a term Tom has used before, the idea of retrieval. That what Tolkien and Lewis are both doing, in a sense, is a form of retrieval, but a Christianized retrieval. We're going to go back to the past. We're going to go to folklore. We're going to go to mythology, all of these things. But we are going to, as Tom just said, rethink these and reinterpret them in light of Christ. And what I find interesting is that overall, whenever you look at reform movements in the church, they're always inevitably built around the idea of retrieval. Every reform movement wants to go back to the early church, and every reform movement picks certain things out of the early church and then continues doing what their culture is doing. Because you can't turn back the clock. And this is something that both, I think, Lewis and Tolkien recognized, that there's no way of bringing back the Middle Ages. You can't do it. You have to deal with the fact that we're living in a modern, or in our case, a postmodern world. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a kind of retrieval that can take place. We're not romantics. We're not Renaissance thinkers in the cult of antiquity where we're trying to bring something back, completely. But what we are doing is taking the things that we can from the past and seeing how we can apply them, I think, in the modern world.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge. I think of that proverb, Solomon, don't say that the former days were better than these. That's not wisdom speaking. That's my paraphrase. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there were things in the past that were pretty great. And it'd be great to have them back. So I'm working on a little piece for the American Mind right now about the town of Battleground, where I live, which is really in some remarkable ways kind of like right out of a Ray Bradbury story. It's got that kind of Americana and sort of wholesomeness that you don't think exists anywhere anymore, but it actually does, and we kind of have it here. And I'm trying to figure it out. How is it possible that this is still the case? Well, partly it's because they didn't let go of some good things. Now, whether or not that'll continue is a good question. And how do you retain the best of the past and remain open to the best of the present and what may come down the road in the future? That's the big challenge. It's like the ongoing challenge. I think that's what a real traditionalist is. A good traditionalist isn't so wooden in his thinking that he can't make room for anything new. It's just that he's trying to make a case for things that maybe other people have lost their ability to appreciate.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a sort of, we've used the word teleology. There's a thread that holds it all together. And it is progressiveness just sees the past merely as setting up for a future that almost emerges, that increasingly detaches and cuts itself from its roots. Whereas I think a living tradition is not one that turns the tradition, like you said, into some kind of ideal. It is something too that moves towards its fulfillment. And just as sort of scripture, when you talk about, Jesus gives, the very Eucharist and says, remember this, right? Why? just because of nostalgia of the event that you weren't at. No, because there is a connection, and of course we tend to talk more of a sacramental connection, but I think reality is that way. I think reality, the way the church began to understand it, is creation that owes everything to God, and that all of those things that it owes to God, when it acts creaturely, is a form of liturgical praise. I mean, this is why Paul will say, when we cease to become thankful and grateful, things got dark, right? And so it's one of the things that I think Lewis and Tolkien really brought to us, was the fact that the older theology would talk about our metaphysical participation, right, as creatures in being and in knowledge. The Reformation tended to emphasize knowledge. But Tolkien and Lewis and the other Inklings tend to recognize that in our participation in Christ, the Word, the creator of all things, is a creative dimension, which means that our language, our work, our life, when it is within the boundaries established by God for flourishing, partakes, co-creates, if you were, or recreates out of the sources that God has supplied, so that we can have dominion the right way, non-idolatrously, but also we can offer all of our human things to God as a form of praise. And this is what I mean by there being a kind of sacramental and liturgical dimension to creation that is something that their emphasis on our creative capacity gets a hold of, that I don't think sheer romanticism does. They definitely drew off of some of the riches of the Romantic contribution without being sucked into it, because they had a richer Christian understanding of things.
Yeah. Well, and I think that within the British Romantic tradition, you do have a strong Christian element in a number of the key Romantic writers. You got some of them that are way off the rails, but there are a number of them that are pretty firmly anchored in the Christian tradition. And I think it would be appropriate to see Lewis and Tolkien as continuations of that British Christian Romantic tradition, which is a bit different from what you get on the Continental Romantics.
Yeah, I guess, when it comes to, say, 19th century Christian practice as it relates to, say, Christmas, you've got things going on at different levels. If we were to think about, the Christmas Carol, Dickens and so forth, that is the setting of this. Christmas is the setting of the story. It's, I think, a rich story, but at the same time, it's not a story that is explicitly telling the gospel story, except maybe in the sense that even Ebenezer Scrooge can be redeemed, and then how does that occur? But it's this framework. So when it comes to that sort of thing, there are some people who are exasperated by that. I guess what I'm getting at is they want things to be so impossible to miss that no one possibly could. For example, when you think about, Pilgrim's Progress, it's awfully hard to miss. What the point? And I think there are a lot of people who want all Christian literature, all Christian storytelling to be like that. I mean, it's impossible to miss the point. But we wouldn't have the Christmas Carol, obviously the title, but also the sort of the observance provides the backdrop for this story that comes to the forefront. You can't have that without a Christian holiday, but also a Christian framework within which to tell a story. So the story does reflect the gospel, but not in the impossible to miss way that I think some people wish it did, or wish stories that are told by Christians would, necessarily have to be like.
Yeah, I think that's a problem very often with particularly evangelical art. And I use the word art advisedly here. That is somehow, if it isn't a if it isn't a tract, in some sense, it isn't really Christian, or it's sub-Christian or something like that. Every Christian movie has to be an explicit story of redemption and salvation by Jesus. Every story has to have that, and so on. And that is a misunderstanding, I think, in a pretty fundamental way of what the biblical worldview has to say about how we interact with the world, as well as a fundamental misunderstanding of art.
Yeah.
Related to this, I'm working my way through Isaiah, my Bible reading in the morning, and I came across a passage. I can't remember the chapter. Maybe it was chapter 22 or 23, something like that, where Isaiah, after these oracles in which he's, prophesying about the destruction of Moab and Egypt and Cush and all this, he makes a statement about a future in which there'll be a highway that runs from Egypt to Assyria, obviously running right through Israel, and that the Lord will be glorified in each nation. That this is something that is to be anticipated. That this blessing of God is going to be enjoyed by everybody in that part of the world, this region. And as I think about the leavening influence of the gospel in the world, I guess I'm thinking of it in sort of in the sense that there's something about the influence of the gospel that is expressed through Christmas that everybody kind of gets, even if they don't really have it all right, if you know what I'm getting at. So they might not be able to tell you, the four spiritual laws, but Stevie Wonder was able to, in that song, instead of in I Wish, saying we had some terrible Christmases where we were so poor we couldn't afford any gifts. Instead, he said, it was a great day, even though we didn't get any gifts, and the joy the day would bring. And and there are plenty of other things that Stevie Wonder sang that are problems, but that particular sentiment that he's expressing is, I think, a praiseworthy one.
That actually raises a question in my mind. When you look at, if you can call them that, secular Christmas songs, what you get, in the past, when you're looking 40s, 50s, even 60s, you get I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
You get I'll Be Home for Christmas. You get chestnuts roasting on an open fire, those kinds of things. And every one of them is focused on family. It's focused on community. It's focused on, nostalgia, tradition, love, all of these kinds of things. When you look at, exclude the Santa Claus is coming to town and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and things like that. But the ones that are looking at the holiday per se tend to be of that sort. When I look at the recent pop Christmas songs, which is what these things would have been and when they came out, you don't see that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You don't see that as much. And I wonder what that means. I am not entirely sure, but I'm wondering if Christmas is sort of losing its moorings.
Well, that, and maybe that's one reason why you still have Bing Crosby singing White Christmas. I was just in a store here this last week getting something, and the guy behind the counter, remarked, because the song was playing over the intercom, and it was Bing Crosby. He didn't know who Bing Crosby was, but he knew the song. He said, "This is my favorite Christmas song," yeah, Bing did it pretty well, But that it gets to your point, and for those who are out to abolish Christmas in the name of Christ. How are they being received? Well, they're Scrooges in the minds of many people. So this is the thing. Who's Scrooge in the in the Christmas Carol? Maybe these anti-Christmas Puritans. Now that would be the association. Obviously, Scrooge's humbug is intended to be a dismissal of just human sentiments in general, not just the holiday. But in the minds of many people, that's who, they'd either think of the Grinch or they would think of Scrooge, those two guys, and associate it. Anybody who's against Christmas must be either Scrooge or the Grinch. I saw this. I saw this was cruel. I mean, I saw this on Instagram. There was this guy who dressed up like the Grinch and came into a house with a bunch of little kids and started packing up the Christmas presents to steal them. And they were just weeping and screaming. Anyway.
On that note,
I think it was probably their uncle or something like that.
That sounds like an uncle. Yeah. So I guess the question that we need to be thinking about then is, how do we do the kind of retrieval that we're talking about, or how do we encourage the kind of retrieval in the culture? We can't go back to the 1940s and sing "I'll Be Home for Christmas."
Yeah.
We'll play it, but we're not going to get that again. We do get some good Christmas carols that are being written now. Peterson, Andrew Peterson. We have some things like that, but how do we, in a culture that is putting up Christmas decorations before Halloween and then taking them down the day after rather than on Epiphany, how do we begin getting people even in our churches to recognize what Christmas means within the deeper Christian tradition? And I'm not talking about recovering the true meaning of Christmas, which everybody talks about, but nobody really seems to understand. How do we get that to happen? To really sink into the roots of what Christmas has historically meant within the church, what it is really celebrating.
I wonder if it doesn't have to do with just the speed of life. I just remember a childhood in which the rhythms of the year were more, present or more easier to discern or to sort of follow and be carried along by. So my life is just so busy. Everything seems like a blur. And, I'm on a jet plane, twice a month. I'm always feeling like I'm behind. I've got things that are demanding my attention. And even though I observe the weekly rhythms of, worship and work and so forth, it just seems like you got to create or you got to have that kind of space to receive the time of the year that you're entering into. That's a mixture of metaphors there, but I think you get my drift.
I think maybe another part of it is we need to recover Advent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because people think Christmas Day ends the Christmas season. Christmas Day begins the Christmas season, and Advent is intended to be a time of preparation repentance, all of these kinds of things, looking to the celebration of Christ's first coming and in anticipation of Christ's second coming.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I've been in churches where I've served as pastor, and we've had an Advent sort of liturgical approach to Advent and of recognize. But even then, I just didn't seem like it seemed like Advent was rushed. If you get my drift,
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic. I'm just wondering if we're not dealing with some kind of larger, sort of problem with our world.
Well, I do think the old theological, call to sanctify time, and the Wesleyans were actually good at emphasizing that. And then you can get, if you get the output of Charles Wesley songwriting just by sanctifying time, and again, they were at a slower time. But I do think there are ascetic practices as Christians in the modern world that we are going to have to partake of intentionally in order to have a different relationship to time. And I think Glenn's point is right in one sense. Of course, the human counterpart to the word is the liturgical worship of the church, right? In its patterns and rhythms. And so I think you're right. A conversion of our relationship to time needs to be a part of that liturgy, not merely just trying to rush it or go with the flow with the rest of our lives. And I also think, and this is a long game, but when you think of the Holy Spirit, take the transcendentals, right? You have truth, but truth is not separated from word, which means there is a counterpart in the world of our word back to God, right? Our worship. But the other part is the Spirit's endowment of the church. Its spirit in Christianity is also called gift, donum, right? And as gift, it is a reminder that the goodness of creation is bound up with gift. And it requires us to be converting things that we take as givens, like time and the material world and the way it's structured, as though they're not contingent gifts that can be related to differently. We may not know how to do it, but I think our relationship to reality has to be intentionally driven by our deepest convictions. Otherwise, I don't think we have any way of really getting a hold of it. I mean, we're not, unless we're going to kind of go, live in the desert, we're not going to be able to slow the world down. But we can be related to that world differently. And again, I don't know what it looks like, but I know where to look. You know what I mean? And Christmas reminds us of that. Those little hints of these songs. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a great, I think, note to end on. We've gotten to the end of the show. Anything you want to say as we conclude, Glenn?
One of the things that I'm doing is Malcolm Guite has a series of poems for Advent, a poem a day, starting on December 1st. I'm reading those as a way of trying to deepen the experience of leading into Christmas as part of a discipline to try to sanctify the time.
Great. Anything you want to add here, Tom, as we wrap up?
No, I think I've said enough.
Okay, well, thinking about Malcolm Guite got me thinking about the fact that we're going to be in the UK at the end of May, and that has firmed up a bit. We still have some financial goals that we need to meet in order to make the trip a smashing success, but the basics have been covered by a very generous donation by one of our listeners, so we're very glad for that. So we are going to be in the United Kingdom in Oxford, May 22nd through the 29th. And we're going to be doing a number of things. One of the things we hope to do is a documentary on the Inklings. We also hope to do a number of podcasts. We're going to record in different locations. Of course, there are some things we'd love to be able to do at different locations, like the Eagle and Child or so forth, but we haven't worked on making any of those things actually come about yet. So these are just dreams at the moment. But we'd love you to pray for us as we prepare for this. Pray that we are able to, raise the balance of the funds we need, and that everything will come together the way we hope. And there will be a way for you to help out. We're going to probably do another Kickstarter campaign to give people an opportunity to be a part of the whole effort. In an ongoing way, we appreciate all the folks who give to us regularly through Patreon. And we don't take those folks for granted at all. And if you'd like to join that select number, the elect, Patreon supporting folks who support the podcast, there is a link in the show notes, and it'll take you there, and it'll be really easy for you to figure out how to do that. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy the book by Jason Cherry, The Making of Evangelical Spirituality, available on Amazon.